Now we get to my favorite part of this study. So we want to look at in this session the second key event in world history that has to be considered when you're building the biblical creation model if you want to properly understand the evidence around us. That's what we're going to dive into now. So we ended with Adam and Eve being evicted from the garden. Obviously, life is going to be different for them. The earth is going to be very different for humanity than it would have been if they'd been able to stay in the garden. And interestingly, Scripture is almost completely silent about those events. Over the next 1,500 years, 1,600 years, really, Moses essentially pushes fast forward, and we fly through the centuries up to the flood. The lifespan of the patriarchs from Adam to Noah are given there in chapter 5. And those Bible believers who would argue for an old age of the earth as promoted by uniformitarian geology will sometimes try to add gaps into these genealogies to accommodate an older earth. And in response to that, besides the fact that the dating methods that are used to date rocks, for example, are based on uniformitarianism, which is easily shown to be a terrible assumption in geology, and besides the fact that even if you squeeze time in to these genealogies, you're squeezing time in when humans are already on the scene, which doesn't really help you make the Bible fit with geology. But also the way that Moses states the genealogy here leaves no room for gaps. Over and over throughout the chapter, he uses this formula. Person X lived A years and had Y, then X lived B years, and then the total life of X was A plus B. And so with this formula, he nails down this chronology tightly and allows no gaps in this pre-flood period. The Genesis 5 is one of the primary biblical evidences that the earth has to be relatively young and doesn't accommodate modern uniformitarian thinking. So simple math shows that there's about 1,650 years from creation to the flood. And also, in the New Testament, Jude 14 verifies that there aren't gaps by calling Enoch the seventh from Adam, which lines up with these Genesis 5 genealogies. Now, it's true that we can't really know the exact number of years back to creation because we know, for example, that Noah didn't probably have Shem on Noah's birthday. You know, it wasn't that Noah lived 500 years exactly and then had Shem on his birthday. Shem probably didn't have Arphaxad on Shem's birthday, notice. And so there's a potential rounding there of a few months for each one of those patriarchs to round to the specific year it's talking about. But if we assume that the Hebrew text is correct in its transmission as opposed to the Septuagint or the Samaritan Pentateuch, most of our translations are based on the Hebrew text, then we can be confident that the span of time between creation and the flood is about 1,656 years, give or take about 5 years. So this is a chart showing the lifespans of each of the 10 patriarchs mentioned in Genesis 5, from Adam up to the flood, based on the Hebrew text. And so you have 1,650 years approximately from creation to the flood. Notice that Adam is actually alive to meet all of the patriarchs except for Noah. He would have actually been alive to meet them. Methuselah actually dies the year of the flood. Okay, Lamech pretty close to it. In the average lifespan, not counting Enoch, who was taken from God, remember, average lifespan is 912 years. Now, how in the world do we explain that? Well, this is a clue about life in the pre-flood world, a world which Peter, remember, describes as having perished. The world is very different after the flood occurred. Well, keep in mind that the land itself was apparently configured differently in this pre-flood period. Remember, possibly alluded to there in Genesis 1:9. God gathers all the water together, the text says, into one place. What does that imply about the land? You have no doubt heard of Pangaea, the supercontinent thought to have existed in the past, that combined all of today's continents together into one. Alfred Wegener is often mentioned in association with Pangea, and it was as though he's the one that came up with this idea. But it was actually a biblical creationist by the name of Antonio Snyder Pellegrini, who was one of the very first ones to suggest that the Earth's continents seemed to fit together like puzzle pieces. So this is a drawing that he actually made in 1858, several decades before Wagner was on the scene developing continental drift theory. And so this is the idea that the continents drift around on the mantle. And Snyder Pellegrini believed that the biblical flood may have been what actually broke up the supercontinent Pangea. Now continental drift has been replaced with plate tectonics, which is the idea that the entire crust of the Earth is broken into big plates that are moving, including the ocean floor. They move around on the mantle. And so this puzzle piece fit of the continents is a powerful evidence for Pangea, but it's not the only evidence. Today, scientists can use, for example, GPS and determine how fast these plates are moving and their heading. And so from that movement, they can extrapolate backwards and reverse their current trajectory and get an idea of the continent's locations in the past, including moving it back into this Pangea-type movement. So Pangea shape. So his plate tectonic theory is able to explain why, when those trajectory of the continents are reversed, they do converge and fit this. But it also explains why, when this puzzle is put back together, there are matching rock layers that go across the pieces, and even mountain belts that are now on different continents, separated by oceans, but fit together when the continents put back together. The Appalachian Mountains, for example, that we're in here, the northern part of that, become the Caledonian Mountains of northern Europe when you put this back together. It also explains why there are matching fossil distributions that go across these continents when you put it back together. And so many other things. So this theory, plate tectonics theory, has great explanatory power, but how would Pangea fit within the biblical frame, the biblical perspective, when the rate of the motion of these continents that we observe is on the order of centimeters per year? It's as fast as your fingernails grow. And so it would take eons for the continents to get to their current position. But as usual, modern naturalistic theories are always based on bad assumptions. In this case, uniformitarianism. Uniformitarianism, which you'll hear me say a lot this weekend, this is the idea in geology today that whatever you see going on today geologically, you assume it's always gone on that way in the past. So whatever rates you see going on, movement, erosion, mountain building, whatever it might be, it's only ever gone on like that in the past. You just assume that. So cataclysmic events, which we can't witness today, you assume that never happened. Like a global flood, creation, you assume that never happened because it didn't happen today. So if the continents are moving today at centimeters per year, they must have always moved that slowly, and therefore it must have taken eons for the continents to fit together like this. But is that a good assumption? Well, remember, the Bible can be known to be inspired because it has, remember, supernatural characteristics, qualities that prove it to be above human capability, and we talked about that last night, which means that it is a true account of history, which means that uniformitarianism is false. Catastrophism is true because we know the flood occurred. That's not something that happens today. So the geologic effects of any global catastrophes in the past would have to be considered if they could play a role in plate movement, for example, or in any geologic event. And so that's what we're moving up to here, is talking about the implications of what happened in the flood. So we're trying to, at this point, though, to consider the implications of the scientific evidence with regard to what we can learn about the pre-flood world. And what we see is that the earth was very different. And so, in fact, there's evidence that there was a supercontinent prior to Pangea. Okay, so when you piece Pangea back together, we find again that the Appalachians of the eastern U.S. continue into Europe, become the Caledonian Mountains. Okay? And so when you can examine the nature of the rock layers found in those mountains, you find that the mountains have layers in them that were laid down in the flood before they were buckled to form the mountain chain, which means that the Appalachians weren't formed until the flood. So when you understand that mountains form due to tectonic plates smashing into each other, it suggests there was a pre-flood continental configuration that converged to form Pangaea during the flood. And so that pre-flood configuration we sometimes call Rodinia. And it also is suggested by the fact that, mountains form as tectonic plates smash into each other. One of the things that we'll find as we study the flood here in a moment is that the bulk of the Earth's mountains were likely formed during the flood, which suggests something about the pre-flood Earth. It suggests that the pre-flood Earth was likely much flatter, okay? And that's going to be very important in trying to understand, trying to make sense of what's going on during the flood. All right, so also you're thinking more flat, maybe more rolling hills and plains, some higher elevation places, which, by the way, may be what we see going on there's parts of the Ozark Mountains that actually may be part of the pre-flood mountains. We could talk about that. But we don't know much about what the original Earth would have looked like before the flood, except beyond a few clues, because the remnants of those continents are very small and incomplete. God literally completely destroyed that world in the flood and then redeposited the pre-flood material in the form of these sedimentary rock layers. So the fossil record doesn't support evolution, it supports creation in the flood, and it teaches us a lot about the pre-flood world biology-wise. So there's things we can learn about biology of the pre-flood world. How so? Well, when we know in the geologic column and the fossil record where the flood begins. It's the Cambrian explosion way down here. And we know about where the flood ends at the top of the Cretaceous. Okay, and so this is, so by studying the fossils in these rock layers and before, what are we learning about? Well, we're getting a snapshot of what living creatures look like at the time of the flood and before. And what we see is that in many cases, the living creatures look pretty different, some cases not so much. Regarding plants, we find that plants were abundant, grew to be large and lush. In the pre-flood world, the trees of petrified forest in northeast Arizona are trees understood to be from the pre-flood world that were torn up and buried and then petrified rapidly in the flood and then transported to the area that they're found in now. The immense coal deposits found in the flood layers highlights how lush the pre-flood world was and how many plants there were. The rock layers in the flood seem to indicate higher levels of oxygen in the pre-flood world. Recall the enormous fruit still growing in Palestine a few centuries after the flood, where two Israelite men had to carry a cluster of grapes on a pole between them. There in Numbers 13:23. This kind of thing was probably not unusual in the pre-flood world. The large reptiles of the pre-flood era, of course, your dinosaurs. This is a Brachiosaurus that was on display at the British Natural History Museum. There's an Argentinosaurus at the Fernbank Museum in Atlanta, which is thought to be the largest, at least at this point, maybe the largest dinosaur ever. And so notice I'm standing beside him to show you the scale we're talking about. Here's a plesiosaur, so this is a marine reptile. Again, you can see me for scale beside him there. Insects were huge as well. We have fossil evidence of dragonflies with wingspans of over 2 feet, the Meganeura. Also millipedes that were up to 7.5 feet long. Okay, you could ride on these things. I think if I saw that, I would run. Today, there's 21% oxygen in the atmosphere, but there's evidence that in the pre-flood world, it could have been as high as 35% oxygen in the atmosphere, which would have helped promote health and life longevity and size. So all these things we can learn about the pre-flood world by studying the fossil record and geologic column. And there's some things we can learn about humans. We know from Genesis 4 that they were intelligent from the beginning. They're already building cities, inventing musical instruments, doing farming, working with cattle, even working with bronze and iron, all before the flood, which has some implications about, you might tend to think, that the ark was made with just wooden pegs. Maybe not. There may have actually been steel. They could have been using steel braces and so forth. We can learn about the appearance of humans to some extent, because while the entire human habitat is absent from the flood layers, entire human habitat is absent from the flood layers. You may want to ask me about that in the Q&A. It was completely obliterated. We can look at what humans look like immediately after the flood and get an idea of what Noah and his family may have looked like. And there's a lot of variety in the human kind, as there is in the dog kind and the cat kind and every other general group of creatures. Evolutionists tend to give new species names to groups that share similarities that are slightly different from other varieties that we would say actually probably all fit within the same general kind that Moses is referring to. And so it is with, for example, Homo erectus and Homo diminuti that you'll hear sometimes in the media. Statistical and biological studies by creationists have revealed that Homo erectus is just a variety of humans in the past that had, for example, a slightly more pronounced brow ridge, a weaker chin, rather than the more pronounced chin that we have, most of us have today. So this is what the fossil record reveals humans look like at the time of the flood. Also, humans, of course, live longer. So why is that? Well, we don't know, but we can postulate scientifically some different reasonable factors. Was there lingering effects from the tree of life? There would have no doubt been less genetic degeneration by this point. The genome would have been created perfect by God. And since then, it's now deteriorated significantly. We've had a lot more mutation and so forth that is built up in our genomes. But at that time, there would have been less disease and sickness. Radiation would be a huge issue. Studies by creation geologists and geophysicists have revealed that the nuclear decay rates of the elements were accelerated by huge factors during the flood, resulting in an immense amount of radiation in a short amount of time during and immediately after the flood for a period of time. So how would that have affected the human genome? I mean, who knows? And what's more, besides plants and animals, we know humans of giant stature walked the earth, referred to there in Genesis 6:4, and then continued to for some time after the flood. And we'll look at this in a later session. We know that after the flood, they could reach at least 6 cubits in a span, what scholars think is 9 feet 9 inches tall, which was Goliath's approximate height. Before the flood, humans may have been capable of even more height. And one final aspect here that we can draw from the text, after creation but before the flood, based on the genealogies of Genesis 5, we get a rough idea of how long people are living before the flood, and we find out how much time there was from creation to the flood, roughly 1,650 years. So with that information, we can get a rough estimate of how many people probably were on the earth by the flood. But we have to make some assumptions. If we assume that the age of these guys is representative of people in the pre-flood period. So if we assume they lived 900 years on average, and women continued having children for roughly the first half of their lives, as they do today, keeping in mind that they may have been able to have kids much longer, 800 years. But this would be 450 years, half of that. So if they started having children at the conservative age of 25, and we assume that people live long enough to see all of their grandkids, so 2 generations, and it was probably longer than that, with those very conservative assumptions in place, we see there could have easily been 215 million people on the planet at the time of the flood. And that's really the low end. Likely it was way more than that. And some commentators have estimates even higher. Genesis 4:26, the very last verse of chapter 4, tells us that after Seth had Enosh, men began to call on the name of the Lord. That's a key phrase that's found throughout the Bible. And chapter 5 then gives us the lineage of Seth and Enosh, the generations of individuals, presumably, who were doing that, calling on the name of the Lord. And things gradually change over the next 1,600 years. The reason for the flood, given in the text, is that every intent, every intention, the ESV says, of the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually. Think about that. I mean, our world's bad, okay, but people aren't to a point where most people don't ever do anything good. Okay, what this is saying, it got so bad that if somebody did something good, they didn't mean to. Okay, their intent was only evil continually. That's bad. And there's some places in our country where arguably that's what's going on, but not many. We're not that bad yet. So how did it get that way? Well, the cause of that wicked state is given in verses 1 and 2 of the chapter, of chapter 6. The sons of God, and we could talk a lot about that. This is apparently, and in context here, the good people that have just been talked about in the context, who were calling on the name of the Lord, those following God, keeping in mind those chapter divisions weren't in the original text. They were added later for our convenience. The context here seems to be talking about the sons of God here being the righteous people began to notice physical beauty and prioritize that in their marital decisions instead of spiritual things. And so the good people started marrying the daughters of men, an idiom for the worldly people, based on their physical beauty rather than spiritual beauty. So let that be a warning to young people about what qualities you prioritize in your dating and marriage decisions. Well, verse 3, notice the phrase, his days shall be 120 years. And some take this to mean that, God is setting an upper limit as to how long man was going to be able to live from then on. He can't live for 900 years anymore. It's going to be 120 years max. Now, that doesn't seem to work for a few reasons. Number one, Albert Barnes in his commentary makes a good point that man in this verse is referring to the whole race of man rather than the plurality of individuals making up the human race. And so the 120 years would seem to be referring to the whole life, the life of the whole race of man. The whole race is going to die in 120 years. Number two, man kept living beyond 120 for centuries after this statement is made. You see in the genealogies in Genesis 11. Number three, it would be strange, would it not, to arbitrarily select 120 years as your upper life longevity and say, okay, you're being punished, you're only going to live 120 years now. That would be kind of a strange punishment to just select 120 like that. And number four, again, you got to consider the context here. What is the punishment that God is going to bring on the human race here? It's the flood. We're moving up to the flood. And so the punishment being referred to with 120 years would seem to have to be related to that. So it makes more sense contextually to be saying, man is wicked, I'm not going to put up with it forever. My spirit's not going to tolerate this forever. I'm going to reach a breaking point. You've got 120 years. Right? So there's, by the way, the grace of God. The grace of God is being manifested. God, what would you or I do if people are that wicked? We'd say, God, can you just kill them right now? Well, God gives them 120 years of preaching. There's the grace and long suffering of God. The judgment comes, but they had 120 years to get their act together. There's God's grace. The world around us, the religious world around us says, no, God would never kill the world. No, they don't understand how God's grace plays out. God's judgment's going to come. He may be long-suffering, but it's going to come. Better get your act together. Now, incidentally, when you think closely then about the text here, based on that recognition of what the 120 years is probably talking about, we see that Noah is 500 when Shem, Ham, and Japheth begin to be born. The flood comes when he's 600. That's not 120 years. That's 100 years, right? So from that, we gather that the statement by God here in verse 3 is made during the genealogies of Genesis 5, just before this verse. So God apparently made the decision to bring about the flood in 120 years from that point. 20 years later, Noah starts having Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So the first 20 years, he didn't even have those three sons, which, by the way, I would say it's highly unlikely that he didn't have a lot of other children. I mean, because if he's doing what God expected him to do and being fruitful and multiplying, filling the earth, he's got a ton of kids and only 3 of them are saved. Isn't that sad? So even Noah's kids, of which there could have been hundreds. So God instructs Noah to build a boat, 300 by 50 by 30 cubits. And according to scholars, this is a football field and a half long, 75 feet wide, 45 feet tall. He's told to make the ark out of this unknown wood, gopher wood, put 3 levels on it, and have rooms for the animals in it. Cover it with pitch so that it wouldn't leak. Put a door in the side of it. God tells him to install an opening. This isn't exactly a window like we tend to teach kids, but according to the underlying Hebrew, this is an opening, apparently for light, possibly ventilation, that went around the top of this vessel and was a cubit in height. According to Genesis 8:13, a covering or awning of some sort is put over this opening as well, which was then left until the end of the torrential rain period, and then Noah opens this window-like structure to see the state of things after that. This is important. God apparently sent the animals he wanted on the ark to Noah. Noah didn't have to go hunt these down. And that's significant because if you're Noah, you got to figure out the perfect representative for the kind of variety God wants in the post-flood world. What if the selection you made just happened to be more genetically degenerate than the others? That's a lot that he would have to know. So he doesn't have to do that. The text says they're going to come to him. God's going to make them come. This is one of the evidences of miraculous involvement in this process here. And this is one of the things you got to be careful about as a creationist, creation scientist. You can't just assume God did it anytime there's a problem. Okay? Because that promotes scientific laziness. If God wants us to study this and figure it out, you don't want to say he did something that maybe he didn't do. But if the context demands that there could be a supernatural involvement, okay, this is a place where you've got to consider that. And it's in several places here in the text. God's involved in this part. So a male and female representative of the unclean kinds of animals, according to chapter 7, 7 representatives of the clean kinds of animals. This could be 7 pairs. I've seen arguments on both sides. The Hebrew is kind of difficult here. But I think at this point I'm leaning towards 7 pairs, but it could be 7 individuals too. And again, these are representatives of kinds, not species. Animals from the earth, including birds and creeping things, which would have included various reptiles, possibly, including also some of the what we would call maybe bugs in some cases. Noah also brings food for his family and the animals, and then after loading up, God himself shuts the door to make sure there's no leaks, I'm sure, and then the fireworks begin. That brings us right up to the flood, the most catastrophic, violent event in world history. God himself actually did this. The more I study this from a scientific perspective, the more I am in awe of what happened here. The works of the Lord are great, studied by all who have pleasure in them, the things God has done. They're worthy of our study and thought. They are intended to be remembered. They tell us about him. And the flood is one of the greatest works he ever did. And the Bible only gives us a few details about it. We know that it occurred 4,000 to 6,000 years ago, was global in its extent, so it covered everything. The fountains of the deep were broken up, and water came from above. The mountains rose, the valleys sank. It lasted essentially a year. That's about what you got. And that's not a lot to work with to make sense of everything out here. So when you look up from the pages of Scripture and start looking at God's, what we call general revelation, the Bible's his special revelation to us, but he has, Romans 1:20, left evidence of himself through another form of revelation, and that is the general revelation, and we start now to figure out other things about this great ancient work that he brought about. And we look for evidence of that event, and we try to make sense of the evidence in light of that event. We ask questions like, what can we learn further about this? Does the evidence from geology fit with this? The world around us says no way. Some have argued the flood just couldn't have been global. The Bible can't be talking about a global flood here. There's just not enough water on the earth. And so they look at the earth today and say, if the flood happened, where did the water go? Is the water in the sky? No, there's not enough water in the sky. If you take all the water in the atmosphere, emptied on the earth, we estimate it'll only raise the sea level about an inch. Is it frozen in the ice caps? No, that doesn't do it either. That only raises the water level 230 feet. Is it in the crust? Okay, that's a little more significant. There's an estimated 6 quintillion gallons of water in the Earth's crust today. So if you pump all that back out, that only gets the sea level at about 600 feet. So 2 football fields into the sky, that's a lot of water, but that's still insignificant. We're now total, not even up to 1,000 feet here, and we've got mountains that are over 25,000 feet high. And so many of those who consider numbers, again, you can just say, oh, well, God just what? Made the water disappear? Okay, we've got to be careful making that assumption without actually having textual evidence of that. So many that consider numbers like these and still want to believe in the Bible will often reject a worldwide flood and say, well, this was a local catastrophe, and it just kind of, it's giving you the perspective of Noah, what it looked like to him where he was at. And what we're going to see is that argument can't be sustained in light of Scripture or science. Science demands this is a global catastrophe, believe it or not. Let's start with the depiction of the flood. This is what modern Christian scientists believe may have happened during the first few hours of the flood. So maybe a little bit different than what we typically think of. And really, that's pretty light compared. The more I'm studying this, the more I see that's not violent enough. Modern Christian science theorizes much of the water did come from the oceans, from below the earth, rather than just from clouds above, which is what was kind of once thought. But keep in mind, it's incorrect to even view this as only involving water coming down and the water rising. The flood is a major geologic event. The earth is totally restructured. The phrase, the fountains of the great deep were broken up, is significant. The great deep refers to the depths of the ocean, which sounds like the breakup of the ocean floor. Proverbs 3:20 mentions this as well, stating that the depths were broken up. So the flood is a major geologic event. And notice the text says all the fountains of the great deep are broken up. There's more than just one, and all of them are broken up, which suggests the breakup of the ocean floor. The order of events is also noteworthy. The fountains of the deep are broken up. That's mentioned first. The rain is mentioned second, possibly a consequence of the first. So what exactly initiates this? Did God just miraculously, directly initiate the eruption of the fountains of the great deep? Maybe. Did he use some kind of external physical entity, like meteorites hitting the earth? Now, interestingly, again, when you do science, you go out and study geology, we find a substantial amount of physical evidence that suggests a lot of meteorites struck the earth during what we believe to be the flood, when we look at those layers. Secular geologists tell us there are roughly 200 identified meteorite craters on the earth that have been verified as being from meteorites. Could be more, but these we feel confident about. And when you convert the dates that they give for those craters and look at where they're at in the layers, and we look at where those fit with regard to the Bible, we find that 50% of the confirmed meteorite impacts throughout Earth's history struck during the single year of the flood. Another 23% of the confirmed meteorite impacts date to the period immediately following the flood, from the flood up through the Ice Age and up to Abraham. So 80% of all the known meteorite impacts occurred during the flood and during the following few centuries as the earth is calming down. It seemed to you like something significant's going on there? Right? I don't think you can ignore that physical evidence. Well, regardless of what started it, creation geologists have tried to piece together what may have occurred after that. Based on what we understand about geology today, geologists have determined that the interior of the earth is comprised of a solid inner core, a liquid outer core, a mantle of predominantly solid rock, although the upper part of it has some plasticity, and then you have the crust upon which we live. And so when you look at the surface, we've discovered that the surface is broken into plates that move around on the order of centimeters per year. And so the earth is like a big cracked egg, and the earth is apparently unique in that, is the only known planet to have plates like this, which means something interesting is going on here. Creation geologists believe that the cracking of the egg may have been what initiated the flood. And there's been a flood of recent articles by secular geologists, interestingly, that suggest that plate tectonics may have been initiated by meteorite activity. And so the model that describes the motion of these plates and the effects that occur from those motions is called plate tectonics. So how do they know plate tectonics theory is likely true? Well, several ways, and this is talked about in the Flooded book. You can use GPS to detect the movement of the Earth's crust. Also, geologists have used dating methods to get the age of the ocean floor. Okay, now their dating methods cannot be used to give the absolute ages of the rocks. They're going to be wrong because their assumptions are wrong. But they are good at telling you what's older or younger than something else. You just don't know how much older or younger, but they tend to be accurate in telling you what's older. And what they found is that the age of the ocean floor gets older the further away you are from the mid-ocean ridge, for example, suggesting that new ocean floor is being made at the ridge, which then moves away from the ridge in both directions. And then you have magnetic stripes. So when you measure the polarity of the ocean floor, okay, so let's say you took a metal detector and get on the ocean floor, which I wouldn't recommend, and you start walking towards the ridge. As you're going, north and south keep flipping as you go over these. It flips. It's like north all of a sudden is where south is, and it keeps flipping like that. And it's mirrored on both sides of the ridge, which suggests the material comes up and north is pointed in one direction, and then it moves apart, and for something causes north to flip, and now the new material that just came up has the opposite. But notice that it's telling you that the ocean floor is constantly being remade. At the same time, it's telling you something weird's going on. What in the world would be necessary to cause north and south to flip? Now, this is going on in the flood. And so creation geologists or geophysicists are studying this to figure out there's really two possibilities as to what's going on, and neither one of them are pleasant. This is bad. This is terrible things going on in the flood. So magnetic striping is evidence of plate tectonics. And of course, maybe the most obvious way to see the existence of these plates is to mark the locations of earthquakes and volcanoes on the planet. And they clearly make a pattern when you map these out. Now, why would earthquakes and volcanoes happen to line up like this, in these big rings like this? Well, that seems to be marking the edges of these plates. So most geologic activity on the Earth is thought to occur along the margins of these big plates, these big chunks of crust. Because as they move, they rub against each other. And that causes earthquakes. And it causes volcanoes. And it causes mountains. So as these plates, we see different things happen as they move. Some will transform, where they slide past one another, like at the San Andreas Fault out in California. Some will diverge, so they move apart, and new material from the mantle comes up into the gap. And so you see this under the water at mid-ocean ridges. There's, in Arizona and New Mexico, there's like 1,000 volcanoes out there, and you have a divergent zone like that, and it causes volcanoes there. Some will converge, where they smash into each other. So if two continental plates converge, then it'll form mountains. And if a continental plate converges with an ocean plate, the ocean plate gets pushed under the continental plate because it's more dense. Okay, so it goes below, down into the mantle. And it'll form volcanoes as it does that, and it'll form those recesses, those trenches when it does that. So mountain building is extremely slow today because the plates are moving slow today. So it would take eons at today's rates to form the mountains. So how do we explain that from a creationist perspective? Well, again, it comes down to this idea of uniformitarianism. The rates going on today are not representative of the past. And amazingly, even the secular geologists, are backing away from strict uniformitarianism because you can't say things like, say, a meteorite struck the earth and it wiped out 75% of the species, including the dinosaurs. You can't say that happened and be a uniformitarian person. That doesn't happen today. Okay, so even they are backing away from strict uniformitarianism. They, in fact, believe, by the way, in at least 5 different major catastrophes that caused huge percentages of extinctions on the planet. They don't know what caused any of them, other than they think the last one was a meteorite. The others, they don't even know. They're actually more catastrophic than we are. Okay? So they're not really strict uniformitarian. But the minute you reject uniformitarianism, you reject every dating method that they have because they're all based on that assumption. If catastrophes have happened in the past, that changes everything. Well, earlier we looked at the idea of Pangea. We saw several evidences for that. The puzzle-like pieces, how they fit together, the fact that the rock layers and mountain belts stretch across these continents when you put them back together. Now, the problem, of course, is the time frame, okay? The rate that they're moving today, has that always been the case in the past? So using the actual evidence from geology and plate tectonics, but without that hidden assumption of uniformitarianism, creation geologists have developed our own geologic theory. Instead of plate tectonics, it's catastrophic plate tectonics, CPT. So a young Earth creation geophysicist by the name of John Baumgartner laid the groundwork for this model back in the early 90s. He developed a supercomputer program while he was at UCLA doing his doctoral research in geophysics and space physics. And the program he developed was called Terra, and it models the interior dynamics of the Earth, the mantle and so on, what's going on there. And so based on the predictions of his program, other creationists, physicists, geologists, paleontologists, meteorologists, astronomers all jumped in and helped to develop catastrophic plate tectonics that describes what could have happened, and at least a big piece of what probably happened at the beginning of the flood. And significantly paraphrasing this, and there's technical peer-reviewed papers on this, by the way, that creationists have put out that you could get into and go down that rabbit hole. But I'm going to paraphrase this in a very basic way. Before the flood, the plates apparently didn't exist. The continents weren't separated. At the onset of the flood, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, Genesis 7:11. So the plates broke apart. Keep in mind, the fountains of the deep here may even be more than just water. Fountains of, for example, magma would have started coming up. So according to catastrophic plate tectonics, something causes the breakup of, for example, the ocean floor. The ocean floor would have been cold and very dense, therefore, and so it would have been broken up in several places, including breaking the ocean plates away from the continental plates. Now, what would happen when you do that for the first time? Well, according to computer simulations, when that break happens, like at the boundaries between continental plates and oceanic plates, there would have been not just subduction of the seafloor, but thermal runaway subduction. Okay, so instead of the creeping rate that the plates are moving into the mantle, the simulations show that at the beginning of the flood, the seafloor is diving into the mantle rapidly. Well, in 1994, when they were developing this, creationists made a scientific prediction and said, okay, if that is true, okay, if we're right that that's what happened, then the mantle would have essentially been overturned like a conveyor belt. And so there should be, therefore, piled up at the base of the mantle, the pre-flood ocean crust. Because this only happened a few thousand years ago. It hasn't had enough time to melt and then recycle back into the mantle. Okay, now notice this is very much different from what would have to be the case if uniformitarianism and conventional geology is true. Because they would say it's always been moving along slowly. So there's plenty of time for this material to melt and get recycled into the mantle. There shouldn't be huge amounts of colder material piled up at the base of the mantle. But we would say this happened fast. So as long as we can tell what's going on down there at the base of the mantle, we should be able to verify that we're right. The plates have moved much faster in the past. All right, so who ended up, at the time, we didn't have the technology to figure out what was going on down there. Well, then the technology caught up. 3 years after the creationist prediction, seismic images of the mantle's density structure verified creationist predictions and showed evidence of enormous piles of cooler slabs of material in the mantle, specifically under these subduction zones, which are apparently remnants of the pre-flood ocean crust that piled up at the base of the mantle. So this rapid diving, what's going to happen when you've got the rapid diving of these plates? They're moving on the order of meters per second, as fast as you can run, rather than centimeters per year. So the supercontinent breaks up, starts moving apart rapidly. This would have caused the rapid formation of mountains along subduction zones. It would have, in convergence zones, and it would have caused materials to be piling up as the plates are diving, smashing into each other. So you picture this conveyor belt. So the cold crust of the ocean floor diving down into the mantle. Okay, new hot mantle material has to come up to the ocean floor to replace that at the divergent zones on the other side. So what's going to happen when you have extra hot magma hitting the cold ocean water? Well, what happens whenever you take water and throw it on a campfire? Well, it immediately superheats it and turns it into steam, right? So there would have been steam jettisoning into the atmosphere. So this magma would have been coming up all along all of the divergent zones all over the earth that are in the ocean, which go for hundreds of miles, okay? Most of these divergent zones are underwater in the oceans. This would have caused intense rain around the globe as these geysers that stretch all over the place erupt and pump water high into the atmosphere, which then comes back down from the heavens onto the land. Okay, now you've got added magma on the seafloor. Okay, what is that going to do besides start superheating the water? Well, it is now going to displace water from the sea onto the land. Okay, so think about this. This hot material that is now replacing the colder ocean crust. The ocean crust is diving down, the colder stuff's going on down. The new material that's replacing the ocean floor, because it's hotter, what happens when you heat things? They expand, okay? So it's now less dense, it's hotter, it's lighter, so it's riding higher in the mantle. So essentially the ocean floor is gradually being replaced. It's all going to be floating higher in the mantle in this heated state. So it pushes the entire seafloor up, creationists believe, 3,500 feet or more. So as the seafloor is raised, now water from the seas starts spilling onto the land and carry with it marine creatures and sediment, which explains why you've got marine creatures all the way across the continents, even in the middle of continents, far away from the ocean. Not just freshwater creatures, but marine creatures. And even on what are now high mountains, which wouldn't have been high mountains then. You got to keep in mind that the higher mountains are forming while this is going on. So they get marine creatures on them, which then get lifted up. So water's coming in from the ocean as the sea level is rising, in addition to the water coming down from these immense geysers. Now you've got major earthquake going on while this is going on under the ocean. What's that going to cause? Tsunamis are destroying the land from this tectonic activity. It's obliterating the pre-flood rock, turning it into tiny grains, breaking it down to grains through erosion, and then they get deposited across the entire continents with sediment being deposited across the entire continents. So most of the water from the flood is coming from the ocean, from all of this going on. And keep in mind, while this is happening, you have the meteorite impacts occurring. Okay, so this is not some gentle, pleasure cruise. The flood is terrible, what's going on here. So I found a simulation that I'm going to show you here. This was by secular geophysicists, and it actually may be correct in depicting what the pre-flood world may have been like. There really is no way to know. There's just so few pieces left of what this could have been like. But what they do is show you, based on, for example, the magnetic striping, where the various pieces moved over time. Now they're thinking in terms of hundreds of millions of years. We would say all of this is happening rapidly in the flood. And so what I did is I I'm going to show you where all the known meteorite impacts from the flood, where they hit and when they strike during the flood. I add those to the simulation and show what's going on with this. Now we keep in mind that this is only the craters that have been discovered thus far, and also obviously any meteorites that struck the ocean areas during the flood wouldn't leave craters so readily for us, or at least it would be hard for us to find them, which is why the verified meteorite craters are land craters. In order to get a better idea of how many meteorites actually struck during the flood, you have to add quite a few more. So far, there's over 100 meteorite craters that correlate to the flood, but 70% of the surface of the earth is in the ocean. And so if you take what we know about the land and extrapolate to the ocean areas, and if we assume that they were striking the ocean at the same time, you got to add around 230 more meteorite impacts. We're talking over 330 meteorite impacts occurring during the flood. So this seems to be a significant part of the flood. So notice the ways that you could die. Drowning would be kind of easy. You know? And don't forget, we're doing science here. We're supposed to be thinking, what do we learn about God? One of the big purposes of science is to learn about God. What is he like? Look at Psalm 104. You covered the earth with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. At the sound of your thunder they took to flight. The mountains rose. The valleys sank down to the place that you appointed for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass, so that they might not again cover the earth. So in light of verse 9, this seems to be referring to the flood, not creation week. Otherwise, this passage would have been violated during the flood. So if this refers to the flood, it makes perfect sense. It fits with the model that creation scientists are arguing for now. The high mountains are not forming until during the flood, when the plates are smashing into each other at convergence and subduction zones. So now, due to the formation of the mountains in the flood, it is now impossible for there to be enough water to again cover the earth, which is what this passage seems to be saying. By the mountains rising and the valleys sinking, which would be these big ocean trenches, a boundary has been set so that the water can't again cover the earth. The only way to do it would be to totally erode down the mountains, for example, and the continents. And there would have to be enough time to do that, and God's basically saying there won't be enough. A boundary's been created, that's not going to be able to happen again. The end will come before that happens. So according to the text, the rain itself continues for 40 uninterrupted days and nights, but that wasn't the extent of the catastrophe. The waters apparently continued to rise for some time after that. So this isn't just 40 days and 40 nights. The water's continuing to rise. Now, based on catastrophic plate tectonics, that would apparently be due to the ocean floor being continued to be overhauled. So that's gradually making the ocean floor, as it's getting overhauled, is now getting taller all the way across the ocean floor until it's totally overhauled. Which, by the way, we can get dates of the ocean floor, and we find that the ocean floor is way younger than the continent. So the ocean floor was totally overhauled in the flood. It actually fits with what we're saying happened. So the water continues to rise, and then the waters eventually level out, apparently beginning to decrease on the 150th day. So that's 5 months from the beginning of the flood. And what's interesting about that is the final things getting buried are the dinosaurs, and they're still alive because their footprints are all over the place. So they're alive for weeks, maybe months, while all this is going on. And then they're getting obliterated. I mean, the fossil beds I was studying of dinosaurs in Wyoming, and the seismites there, they are getting the kind of power being unleashed by the earthquakes, like as the Rockies are forming, is making the dinosaurs explode. They're shards of them, bits and pieces. Some of them are sticking out of rock formations that only form from earthquakes we don't have a way to reckon how big the earthquakes would have had to have been to form these. So the water of the flood is probably not blue. It's probably red, a lot of it. I mean, this is very violent and bloody, what's going on here. Notice that during this catastrophic period, typical earth processes, of course, are totally disrupted. Seasons, day and night. After the flood, God promises Genesis 8:22, he's not going to allow that to happen again on a global scale. Again, we would expect this with catastrophic plate tectonics. So you've got a lot of extra cloud cover for a period of time because you got more water, but you also got a ton of aerosols from volcanic activity in the atmosphere, from meteorite atmospheric debris as well hitting up into the atmosphere. All of that's going to stop day and night, block out sunlight, and with it summer, much of the heat we receive. Obviously, seed time and harvest is going to be stopped while the earth is covered with water. All right, so let's return to this question, this quibble. How could the flood be global? How could there be enough water to cover the earth, prevailing over the mountains over 20 feet? Well, with this model I've laid out for you here, this helps you to understand why you need to have these, because it helps to answer these kind of quibbles. So let's think of the science side first. Remember that CPT theory would say that the water came primarily from the seas, both in the form of rain, from these geysers, and from the sea level being raised due to hotter ocean floors. So when you recall from Psalm 104 that the taller mountains are forming during the flood, and you recall from catastrophic plate tectonics that the mountains are forming as these plates are smashing into each other, then you realize the pre-flood world must have been much flatter. So it wouldn't have taken nearly as much water to cover the land with water at that point, because all the tall mountains hadn't been formed until later in the flood during the recession. That's when these taller mountains start coming up. You have to picture a much flatter earth with a lower elevation, covering the highest points of the pre-flood earth. Wouldn't have required anywhere near the amount of water that it would require today. So where did the water go after the flood? Well, this is answered too. So first of all, as the ocean floor is raised during the flood, and as all this is going on, as the fountains of the deep are broken up and so forth, that activity would have dumped loads of sediment onto the continent, raising the level of the pre-flood continent relative to pre-flood time. Plus, you've got mountains forming at all these different plate boundaries, which raises the land in those areas even further. So notice, without the water going anywhere, the continents are already going to be higher in elevation. They're going to be sticking up out of the water further than they would have been in pre-flood times. But also, you have to consider other implications of catastrophic plate tectonics. So as the ocean floor is diving into the mantle, new materials coming up replacing it. That material's hotter, so it's less dense. So it's sitting higher in the mantle in an expanded state. So then what happens when the entire ocean floor gets overhauled? Well, this conveyor belt process would have abruptly slowed significantly. And so the ocean floor, after it's totally replaced with new material, it slows down, it stops the steam jets. And as that new material on the ocean floor cools, what happens to it? Well, it now becomes more dense again. So it starts sitting lower in the mantle, which allows all the water to go right back to where it came from. It recedes right back to the ocean. So bottom line, there's no problem from science in explaining where the water came from or where it went. I mean, science makes sense of this. Other evidences from science, the Cambrian explosion. Okay, this is a worldwide explosion of fossils that begins at the base of the fossil record. To all intents and purposes, this is where the fossil record begins, and it's not a localized deposit. Like today, when little catastrophes happen, you'll have an area that maybe has a bunch of mud that was deposited or something. No, this is a worldwide deposit of creatures in some kind of fossil forming event, some kind of catastrophe that goes across the entire planet. This suggests a worldwide catastrophic event. Also, at the same time, you've got this long distance travel of sediments. When you look at the material found in the rock layers, for example, the Grand Canyon, okay, in many cases, the material that's in those layers, when they try to figure out where did that come from, it got deposited here, but where was its source? They'll find it hundreds of miles to the northeast, or when you get up to like the Navajo sandstone, it comes from up here. It's from New York. And it somehow got to the Grand Canyon. Okay, now again, when you see today, you think uniformitarianism. Today, okay, you might see some sediment get moved a little ways by a river or something. But it doesn't go thousands of miles and then end up in a place that covers multiple states. The material covers multiple states and is hundreds of meters in thickness. Okay, now this suggests something a little bigger than a localized deposit. This is huge. This is a catastrophic event that would be required to take all that material and move it thousands of miles and dump it. That doesn't happen today. Another evidence, mega seismites. This is where I did some field research on this, and these are these rock layers that form from earthquakes that hit sediment that is wet. Okay, and usually today, when you find these major earthquakes, like 1964 Alaska had like a 9.1 Richter scale earthquake, it formed a seismite about that thick, and you see this layer of sandstone now that's all convoluted from the earthquake. Okay, we're finding seismites that are taller than this building out there. Okay, these are so huge that it only makes sense if you've got like mountains forming rapidly. There's no way to really explain these, and there's tons of these layers, distinct layers out in Wyoming where you had these seismites forming. Other evidences, starting at the Cambrian explosion, so the very beginning of the what we would say the beginning of the flood, it's basically the beginning of the fossil record. And by the way, it's a major problem for evolution. They do not have an explanation for this because the creatures show up all of a sudden. They're fully formed without any evolutionary history. They're complex in many cases, and they're very different. It's not like they're all kind of the same little critters and then eventually turn into other things like the tree of life that Darwin thought would happen. No, they're very distinct creatures, and it's more like an orchard, exactly like creationists would expect. That's what the fossil record shows. But starting down there at the Cambrian explosion, the point where we would say the flood started, you have worldwide beds of sandstone, for example, from some kind, how do you get that? Well, this has got to be some kind of water-based catastrophic worldwide event. Yeah, you can look at these layers like in Grand Canyon, go across the entire continent, jump over the ocean, the same layers continue into Europe. These, again, are not localized beds of sediment like we see happening today. No, these are worldwide beds. They begin at the Cambrian explosion, and then you find similar worldwide beds like that continue up through the geologic column all the way to the point where we think the flood stopped, just above the Mesozoic, right after the dinosaurs. And also, sedimentary rock is the dominant rock type throughout those worldwide layers, just as we'd expect. Sedimentary rock is generally understood to be formed from water activity over 90% of the time. This has to, based on science, there has to be a worldwide water event that was a major catastrophic event that happened. I don't see how you can not say that. It's demanded by the physical evidence. Now you move from science and we look at what the Bible says, and the Bible, of course, doesn't leave any room for a local flood interpretation either. So very quickly, if it was a local flood, why in the world do you build an ark over 100 years or so? Why not just leave the area? You got plenty of time. Why bring animals from all over the place? I mean, God's sending the animals to Noah anyway. Why not just send them out of the area? How would the ark be able to stay afloat for several months if this is just a local flood? And how could the biblical terminology that describes the water as covering the high mountains that are under the whole heaven, how can that be describing a local flood? I mean, how could water even get high enough locally to cover a mountain if the flood isn't greater in its extent? Now I picture the water getting up and it's like it has these edges and it just kind of sits there. That's not how it works. It's not how gravity works. How could the biblically stated purpose of wiping man from the face of the whole earth be accomplished with a local flood? Whenever I had the students out there learning about all this in Arizona, we just went through the text, starting in Genesis 6, and as I read through the text, the kids had to highlight every time there was a word that implied this is greater than a local flood. And we lost track. There's dozens of textual indicators that force you to realize this has to be way bigger than local. You have to be intent on ignoring what the text says because of some of their preconceived idea to reject what it's clearly trying to say. You have to think Science doesn't support this, so I don't want to believe it. That's what you have to do, and you have to force your other ideas on the text. The text is clear on this. This is a big one. If the flood was local, then isn't it true that God lied? Okay, so God says, I'm never again going to send a local flood. Uh-oh. There's been a few local floods since then, haven't there? Okay, there hasn't been a flood like this, but there's been the local floods all the time. Also, Peter uses the universal destruction of the earth and the flood to describe what Judgment Day is going to be like. Okay, so if the flood's not universal, then what about Judgment Day? Why would the seasons have been affected if this is just a local flood? Were seed time, harvest, winter, summer, day and night stopped? Okay, come on, that's bigger than local. Why did the dove find no resting place for the sole of her foot when sent out? Doves can go huge distances. Why did the dove not find a place to rest her foot? This is bigger than local. This is global. So the flood, a very different portrait from the one that maybe comes into our minds when we think of what this event would have been like. This again was no pleasure cruise for Noah and his family. Really, you don't even want to be on the ark. You don't want to be alive at this time. This is terrible, what's going on. And what does that tell us about God? We can't forget that. The world is forgotten. On the same day that the waters began to decrease, the ark rested in the mountain range of Ararat. Where exactly that was, the waters continued to recede for another 4 months. And during that period of recession, we know that the retreating floodwaters are catastrophically eroding many of Earth's canyons, though not all of those. The Grand Canyon was formed probably later. After 9 months, on the first day of the 10th month, Noah could see the tops of various mountains. Another 40 days goes by. He sends out a raven and a dove. He waits another week, sends the dove out again. After it returns, he waits another week, sends the dove out. The dove doesn't return. He waits another month, removes the covering from the ark, sees that the surface of the earth is dry. And after another almost 2 months, the earth is completely dry. They leave the ark. Again, this doesn't sound very local to me. The timeline as given in the text is based on the Jewish calendar, which reckons time based on a lunar year, which is 354 days total. So based on the text, a year and 11 days pass, so you have to convert that to the solar calendar that we use. And so from beginning to end, Noah and the other passengers left the ark after 1 solar year, exactly 365 days. Noah and his family, 8 people, exit the ark, and from those 8 people repopulate the entire earth. So genetically, we all have a portion of Noah and his wife in our blood, regardless of our ethnicity. Now, whether or not the wives of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth were part of Noah's family, were they sisters, were they cousins? We don't know. I mean, is it possible that they married from other Sethite clans or even Canaanite clans? Depending upon the answer to that, the portion of our genes that can be traced solely back to Noah would increase or decrease. But unless all 8 survivors were in Noah's family, then it can't be said that genetically all of our blood came just from Noah and his wife. So that's interesting genetically. The passengers from the ark, of course, come off and find a completely different earth from the one that they knew before the flood. You can only imagine what that would have seemed like. Most of this wouldn't actually be here, right? This would have been a probably pretty desolate carnage, probably corpses. I mean, imagine what you would have seen. This would have been a mess. The animals and plants that had been destroyed. Peter says that the world that then existed perished. And there's no doubt a lot more to what that means than what we typically think of. The world is very different. This chart gives the lifespans of the patriarchs as recorded in Genesis 5 and 11. Notice the approximate 900-year lifespan before the flood, with the exception of Enoch and Lamech. And then notice this drop, this exponential drop in lifespans. Now, granted, the Genesis 11 genealogies are not worded exactly the same as the Genesis 5 genealogies. And so there's a lot of study and discussion that can be done on that. But this seems to provide some evidence for the fact that something is pretty different. It starts at the flood. Something different is going on here that maybe causes the environmental change, is affecting life longevity, for example. So size, health, life, longevity all starts to drop, maybe in a proportional way to whatever's going on the earth as it's calming down after the flood. And as further evidence of the major change that apparently occurred, Genesis 9, verses 2 and 3 says that animals would begin to fear and dread humans. This maybe indicates something about the nature of the animals and how they're responding to what's going on. And then in verse 3, apparently linked with that statement about the animals, you have the first mention of God authorizing a carnivorous diet for humans, which you would think would lead to animals fearing us, right? Now, is it possible that some humans were already eating animals before this? I would say very much possible. I mean, the humans are not obeying God, so why would we assume there's not carnivory among the humans? You definitely see it in the animal kingdom by the time of the flood. But at least at this point, God authorizes it. Another example of how different the world was after the flood is the ice age, or the ice surge, or ice advance, depending upon which Christian scientist you talk to. But we find a lot of evidence that the earth, a large portion of it, was once covered with ice. In fact, 30% of the land, as opposed to 10% today. In fact, you've got, I think, a lot of evidence around it right here where you're at. I don't see it down in Alabama so much, but you've got a lot of evidence up here. So we can observe what happens today when glaciers expand and contract and see the effects of the glaciers when they do that. And from those observations, we infer that the glaciers of the north used to extend deep down into the northern hemisphere. You found what are called parallel striations, so scratches on rocks that extend over miles and miles of plains from the rocks and boulders that are in glaciers. As they expand and contract, they'll scratch and facet the rocks even, wear them flat from the glacier expansion and contraction. You find till and moraine that pile up along, for example, the edges of the glaciers as they move, and it'll leave kind of this little rock fence that's not human-made as the glacier expands, and then it contracts and leaves it, right? So secular geologists believe that multiple ice ages have occurred over a few million years, as many as 50 ice ages. But there's major problems with their interpretation of the evidence for these ice ages. No single theory, from their perspective, has been able to explain all the evidence. And that's one of the important aspects of a theory. If it's a good theory, it has to have good, what we call explanatory power. It has to be able to explain the evidence. Well, for example, why would there have been all of the animal extinctions where you have 167 entire genera of larger mammals? They completely disappear from the earth after only the supposed last ice age. What about the other ice ages? Why would you have what are called disharmonious associations? This is where you have warm area animals like hippos living contemporaneously, same environment, with cold area animals like woolly mammoths and reindeer. Okay, that doesn't make sense that they would be living if you have an ice age in the way they're depicting it. Why would they all be living together? Why is there evidence of wet deserts? Okay, areas that are deserts today, but we get down a little bit under the surface and we find that there was a time when these were wet. These were lush environments. And of course, the biggest issue they have, there is no known mechanism to trigger a single ice age from their perspective, much less multiple ice ages. They don't have a means to actually get one launched. How do you get one started? Well, this is a place where, once again, creation science has given a solid answer how to explain this. In fact, an ice age would be predicted to follow the flood if catastrophic plate tectonics is true. It would be a necessary effect of the flood. The flood would have triggered it. So modern creation science theorizes there weren't multiple ice ages. There was a single ice age. We call it more of an ice advance rather than an ice age because this isn't a long period of time. This is a gradual buildup that lasted only about 700 years with a peak at about the 500-year mark after the flood. So creation scientists would say that all the evidence that secular meteorologists are using to argue for ice ages over millions of years fits into a single major ice age that lasted only a few hundred years. So what do you need to initiate an ice age? Well, you might be tempted to think, well, you just need cold winters. You need the winter to be colder. Well, that'll actually have the opposite effect, because with cold comes dryness, less moisture, which gets at the root of why secular meteorologists can't figure out how to begin an ice age like this, because you have to have the glaciers be able to expand more during the winter than they contract in the summer. That's the only way to get these glaciers to expand. So you need three things. You need cooler summers, so there's less melting, more moisture, so more evaporation of the ocean, and then a persistence of that for long enough for the glaciers to get big. Now, all three of these would have been perfect effects of the flood. According to catastrophic plate tectonics, the volcanic activity, the tectonic activity going on because of the flood, which is continuing for a period of time after the flood, is shooting ash and aerosols into the atmosphere that blocks a lot of the solar radiation, which is going to cool the summers. That would have caused a lot less melting of the glaciers during the summertime. So the ice is now going to continue to advance annually, each winter in waves, instead of melting each summer, which is more what we have going on today. So eventually it's going to cause more and more extinctions towards the peak of the ice's advance, because now the animal habitats are being threatened. The pre-flood environment was also likely warmer, including the ocean, but of course the volcanic activity going on during the flood is going to heat the oceans by several more degrees. What's that going to do? Way more evaporation of the seawater, which leads to intense snowfall, especially away from the equator, since sun rays are going to be halted by the aerosols and ash. Okay, so now you need persistence of that. Well, again, we'd predict that this tectonic activity is continuing due to catastrophic plate tectonics for some time after the flood. So the oceans would have continued providing significantly elevated evaporation for possibly centuries until the Earth finally calms down and things start moving towards an equilibrium state, at which time the ice would have started to retreat. And by the way, creation scientists don't really deny that the Earth is getting warmer, okay? In that sense, global warming. What we deny is that it's been shown that humans are the primary cause of it. Okay, that's a totally different thing. We don't deny that the Earth is heating. In fact, we would say the Earth is probably still recuperating from what happened in the flood. We're moving towards a time when there probably won't be glaciers, the pre-flood climate. All right, so why would that be a bad thing, especially whenever more people die from cold than they do heat each year, things like that. So we would argue not only is there not evidence that humans are the primary cause, there's not even evidence that it would be a really bad thing, even if we were. So we view this whole thing differently than they would. I've seen evidence that makes me think what's going on with the sun and solar flares parallels better what we see going on globally, temperature-wise. But I like Kurt Wise, who's a Harvard creation paleontologist. I think he makes a good point that I think we're just moving back probably towards the pre-flood climate. That's what's really going on. So anyway, towards the end of this major primary melting period, catastrophic melting would be predicted to occur with huge amounts of water being trapped in kind of makeshift lakes as the glaciers are melting, even in areas that are now deserts, which explains evidence for past wet deserts. And as these lakes continued to grow from the glaciers melting, the natural dams holding that water in these makeshift lakes would breach, which would cause the rapid formation of canyons, which is something that even the secular geologists think was a not an unusual thing during ice ages. Like, for example, they'll say that the Lake Missoula flood was a flood from an ice age that occurred due to one of these dam breaches that happened from one of these natural dams in these kind of lakes. And when that particular flood happened, it had caused immense destruction, including a 50-mile-long trench that is between 1 and 6 miles wide, with walls that are up to 900 feet high, carved out of solid rock. Geologists estimate that 10 cubic miles of basalt from the trench were eroded rapidly by catastrophic flooding from that ice age event. And creation scientists believe that, at least many creation scientists believe this is probably what carved the Grand Canyon. And so the layers were deposited in the flood, but during the ice age, We think that there were 3 massive lakes on the Colorado Plateau that breached and then rapidly carved the Grand Canyon over a short period of time. A lot more I could say on that subject as well, but we'll keep moving on. All right, so the creationist ice advance theory may or may not be true. Again, this is a theory. It has great explanatory power where modern uniformitarian models fail to explain the evidence. It explains why you have a huge number of animal extinctions only occurring once, because there was just one ice age. It explains the disharmonious association of the animals because you have milder winters, cooler summers that keeps the animals living relatively mixed instead of being forced into more distinct habitats. The evidence for wet deserts is explained. The animal dispersions from Asia over to America across the Bering Strait because you have now a lot more water in the form of ice and clouds, which actually uncovers some of the places where there could have been land bridges that now have water there. The rapid formation of post-flood canyons is explained. The thickness of the ice cores in Greenland and Antarctica, we'll talk about that tomorrow morning, that's explained. And of course the biggest plus is that we have a clear-cut trigger to initiate this ice age period. It's demanded by the flood. And while all of that's going on, humanity lives on, right? They're having to live through all that, and they're reproducing after the flood. And not much is explicitly stated about the period after the flood with regard to human. In fact, there's not even evidence, we haven't discovered evidence of writing at all for some time, right? Genesis 10 and 11 gives genealogical information about the intervening centuries during what creationists theorized to be the ice advance period there between the flood and Abraham, basically. And it helps us to see which line from Noah repopulated which area of the world, but not much beyond that is known. From Seth to Abram, you've got 10 generations, and once again, there isn't any evidence of gaps there. Now that said, while there's no evidence of gaps in this lineup, Moses' terminology in Genesis 11 isn't exactly the same as his terminology in Genesis 5. And when you weigh all the evidence on this, and there's a lot that I could say about this, there is potentially room for a few hundred years in the Genesis 11 genealogies, but you can nail that down, the limit there. And we're not even talking about thousands, much less millions of years that could be added there. This is a few hundred. And we got an article on our website that talks about this. But keep in mind, when we stand back and we look at the question of time and the genealogies, even if Genesis 11 allowed for millions of years worth of time to be injected in there, like as though there's, let's say, 1 million gaps in the genealogies, like Moses just skipped 1 million different gaps, right? Which is ludicrous, but let's just say that that's what happened. It still is not going to cause the Bible to fit the evolutionary paradigm. And here's why. When you look at the actual fossil record as portrayed by evolutionists, guess where humans show up? The genus Homo, what are likely the human group, shows up at the very top. Roughly 2 million years ago, based on the evolutionary time scale. Okay, Genesis 5 and Genesis 11 genealogies are both genealogies of humans. Okay, so where do you have to squeeze the time into the genealogies? It's before the genealogies. This is all the time. This is day 1 through 5 from their perspective. Right? So you squeeze time into the genealogies, it's not helping you. You're squeezing in time up here. You got to have the time down here, and Genesis 1 doesn't allow the time. All right? The Hebrew doesn't allow this. The science doesn't allow it. Jesus doesn't allow it. Mark 10:6, Luke 11:50 through 51 indicate humans are around from the very beginning, not at the very end of geologic time, which is what the evolutionary model would say. So you just can't make the Bible fit with the modern paradigm. You can't do it. And you don't need to. The paradigm that the world is basing their belief on is a blind faith. Major problems with it. It's not what we have. Now granted, what that means is you're going to feel kind of alone and like an outcast and a weirdo. And guess what? The Bible says, that's basically what it means to be holy. It means to be lonely is really what we're talking about. If the world likes you, you're doing something wrong. Right? You just need to accept that. Young people, accept that. They're going to think you're a weirdo. Be okay with it. Noah was a weirdo, but he survived. Right? I mean, to the world, he would have been a weirdo. Moving forward, you have Babel. This is probably at the time of Peleg, based on Genesis 10:25. This could have been as early as 100 years after the flood, or a few decades later, according to the Genesis 11 genealogy. So this would likely fall during the period of the Ice Age, as the Ice Age is picking up, which might explain humanity's reluctance to obey God and spread out, or why God chose to step in when he did and fix that. Because he's trying to, God, of course, is going to be aware of what's going to happen with the Ice Age as it continues to increase. But regardless, there may have been multiple human languages before the flood. The text doesn't really make that clear. But at the time of the flood, they all would have been wiped out except for whatever language Noah and his family are speaking. All right, so from that point to Babel, there is still only one language being spoken after the flood, right? And by the time of Babel, that is the post-flood language, and then the language divisions are supernaturally created by God, and the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth spread out from Palestine. So notably, human fossils and archaeological artifacts don't appear in flood or pre-flood layers. They're all apparently wiped out in the flood, possibly subducted. Human fossils and artifacts don't appear until after the flood. So archaeologists study the artifacts and divide what they call early human history. We would say it's not early human history, because all the flood stuff is before that. This is post-flood human history, but they're calling it you just have to know how to translate what they're saying into the biblical time frame. But they'll divide it into three what they call ages. And really, these are just on the order of hundreds of years each, from our perspective. The Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age. So how do we translate that to the biblical perspective? Well, the Stone Age would correlate to what we would call post-flood to pre-Abraham. The Bronze Age would be Abraham to David, right, roughly 1000 BC. And then the Iron Age from, say, David to Cyrus, although it depends on where you are in the world, right? So that is 550 BC. So we would correlate the Stone Age especially with the dispersion after Babel in the Ice Age period. So archaeologists, they're looking around at the artifacts that have been dug up in those early post-flood layers, and they see evidence that humans were nomadic during that time. They're called hunter-gatherers. They're moving from place to place. I wonder why that is. And so they believe that they were doing that for thousands of years, of course, until they evolved to the point where they began to settle and farm. Again, we would interpret the same evidence differently. First of all, they weren't nomadic for thousands of years, possibly hundreds of years. They're dating the rock layers using erroneous radiometric dating methods. But yeah, we would agree with the evidence that the humans were probably nomadic because this is during the dispersion period. This is after Babel. So after Babel, they're spreading out, filling the earth as God is forcing them to do. So they're nomads. And it wasn't that they weren't intelligent enough to farm and have houses. It's that they weren't allowed to stay put and build houses and make cities and farm. They'd already made that mistake at Babel. Okay, so they're spreading out and filling the earth. Genesis 9:1, God's requiring that. Now keep in mind, this is an important point. Many of the Native Americans that the Europeans discovered in the 15th century AD were also nomads and also weren't writing. Not because of a lack of intelligence, but because they just weren't inclined to put down roots in one place. See, these archaeologists are assuming that humans are just more, ape-like or something because they're nomadic and not making cities yet. No, they're the same as what the Native Americans were here. This has nothing to do with intelligence. So they're not staying put very long. And so you don't expect there to be cities and houses. Instead, you would expect, for example, that they're staying place in kind of a bed and breakfast. Okay, so they're in tents or they're in caves. Okay, sure enough, cavemen are associated with the Paleolithic period of the Stone Age. So people are finding shelter in caves, not because they weren't as intelligent to make houses. That's not what's going on here. They didn't have time to put down roots. Why do you stop and build a house when you got to keep moving? And interestingly, I just read an article in a secular journal in the last few weeks, where they're realizing that these older, supposedly more primitive humans apparently did, even in their pictures, actually had something of a language in them. That what they apparently were doing is marking on the stone possibly where the various water sources were in the area for the next group that might be coming to that same cave. Now that fits exactly with what I would expect. Okay, so if I'm spreading out and everybody's spreading out and I come to this cave and I'm, oh man, we found this water source. Well, hey, there might be another group that as they're spreading out, they're going to come by this cave too. I better mark where that is. Well, that's the kind of thing you do. And by the way, so after a few hundred years, then when they spread out, begin to settle, different types of archaeological artifacts start surfacing. As more products are being developed, it would be useful in a farming culture and in a culture that stays put. So this is what archaeologists call your Bronze Age. And so it's during that time you start finding evidence of writing. Okay, so could humans have written before that? Like during the dispersion, possibly. You'd expect at least they were certainly intellectually capable of it. Again, maybe these drawings are saying something about that. But there also probably just wasn't as much of a need for writing yet. And again, a good comparison would be many of the North Americans the Native Americans here in North America, which, by the way, I say Native Americans from a biblical flood perspective. Really what they are is the descendants of Shem that just got over here before the descendants of Japheth. That's really what we're saying. Okay, so Noah and his family get off the ark, and everybody spreads out. The descendants of Japheth go towards Europe, and the Shemites go east. Okay, the Shemites apparently went across the Bering Strait and went down and populated North America. And the Japhethites, they start going northwest, and they don't get over to America until much later. That's really what we're talking about. There's nobody that is native to any of the world. I mean, everybody's wiped out. Okay, Noah and his family, if anything, you would say they were natives, kind of the mountains of Ararat, I guess. Everybody else is kind of a Johnny-come-lately to it, really. It bothers me, that kind of terminology. But again, because it's very secular in the way it's not biblical. It's just not the way we would describe these things. Anyway, humans would have certainly been intellectually capable of writing, just like the Native Americans could have, even though they weren't writing whenever Europeans came and discovered them. A lot of them were drawing pictures, not because of intelligence. It's just they didn't have probably a need to develop written languages. So keep in mind, whenever God miraculously creates the new languages at Babel, humans may have had to develop the written forms of those languages. Nothing is said about the written languages. God creates the oral languages, and maybe the written languages had to come later. One final interesting point about the Ice Age, as we start wrapping this one up. When did Job live? So, by the way, isn't this cool? I have this depiction here. I had Rob put something together from one of our graphic design guys. So that's I would have been in the fetal position probably as God's talking out of this. The Bible doesn't tell us exactly when Job lived. There's a lot of debate about that, but there's some interesting puzzle pieces in the book that I think shed some light on this, some clues that caused me to feel like, man, he surely lived after the flood. So, for example, a flood is mentioned by Eliphaz, and now floods happen a lot, but I only know of one that is directly mentioned as being a punishment for wiping out wicked men. Okay, this suggests a post-flood date. Job 38:16, God highlights the recesses of the deep, the ocean, which seems to be referring to the deep sea trenches, which don't form until the flood. Also, the text doesn't specifically reveal Job's age when he died. Job 42:16 tells us he lived 140 years after the events that are talked about in the book. Okay, so how old was he when all of that began? Well, okay, he's old enough to have 10 apparently grown children, chapter 1 and verse 4, which suggests that he may have been 50, 60, or higher, which means that he was at least 200 years old. Now, that age was described in chapter 42, verse 17, as being old and full of days. Okay, which wouldn't have described Job if he lived prior to the flood, because people then are living over 900 years. So when you consider that Terah, Abram's father, he lived to be 205. Abraham lived to be 175, Isaac 180. Jacob lived to be 147. Well, then you see that Job's age fits nicely around the time of Abram, possibly just before that. Also, several names are mentioned in Job, which were likely named after individuals mentioned in the post-flood period in Genesis 10 through 36. And so that argues for Job living post-flood, and those same names argue for his living during the pre-Mosaic period in the patriarchal age. So sources outside of the Bible also verify some of those names as being from the second millennium BC, around the time of Abraham. Also, no mention is made of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities of the plain, although surely that would have been known to the inhabitants of Uz, if we understand where that was. While again, the flood is mentioned in the book, as would be expected. So this suggests a pre-Sodom and Gomorrah time period. Also arguing for a pre-Mosaic patriarchal time, Job is described as offering sacrifices for his family. So this is a patriarchal custom that occurred throughout the time before Moses. And his wealth is measured not in money, but in livestock and possessions. Now also, God talks directly to Job in chapters 38 through 42, as he did to the patriarchs prior to Moses. Also, there's no mention made of anything pertaining to the law of Moses or the events affecting the Israelites in Egypt or Canaan, even though Uz, where Job lived, is thought to be in that neck of the woods, which suggests that Job is pre-Moses. And in fact, his daughters are given an inheritance at the end of the book, which was not customary during the Mosaic period. Also, a kind of money is mentioned, which dates back to the pre-Mosaic patriarchal period as well. And also, the style of the book matches other writings that date to the second millennium BC. So these and other factors suggest that the events of Job took place maybe just before the time of Abraham, on the tail end of the Ice Age. So with that in mind, it's interesting to note that cities are mentioned as existing in the book. And interestingly, there are no known cities in Ice Age layers, which are the Pleistocene layers. So cities don't show up until the higher rock layers of the Holocene, which is where Abraham must have lived, because cities are clearly in existence during his time. The 5 cities of the plain, for example, is just one example. But I could only find one reference to cities in the book of Job, which isn't really typical of other Bible books relating historical accounts. So instead, lands are described, or people who eventually had cities or lands named for them. And so Job may have lived on the tail end of the Ice Age and the Babel dispersion, transitioning into the time period when cities were being planted, with his life perhaps overlapping with that of Abraham. Interestingly, snow and ice are also mentioned several times in the book, even though snow would have likely been even rarer in Uz than it is today in Florida, because it's so close to the equator. So why would snow and ice have been such a hot topic in Job? So again, it would fit with Job having lived around the time of the Ice Age. So assuming so, then the book of Job tells us a lot about the mindset of humans at that time after the flood, and it tells us about the animal kingdom and their behavior at that time, including the mention of Behemoth, which is most closely matches the description of a sauropod dinosaur, and Leviathan, possibly a type of large marine reptile like a mosasaur, plesiosaur, something like that. All right, so as we wrap up, consider once again the flood. Isn't it amazing what we can learn about this event from science? It's fun, but it's also alarming. Because again, remember, God didn't want this event forgotten. Why would that be? God likely executed, on the low end, 215 million people by drowning, crushing, burning, mutilation, dismemberment, and disintegration. So the flood tells us things about God, his feelings about sin, his concern for his people, those who are striving to live righteous lives, that they're not forgotten. Jesus, remember, called the attention of his audience back to the flood in Matthew 24. As the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage. All right, they're just going along, doing their day-to-day thing with no concern. until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away. 4 words that describe what I just went through in this session. So also will the coming of the Son of Man be. That warning there, people don't like to think about Jesus, reminding people of that carnage and judgment. Is it important to study the works of the Lord like the flood? Is that important? I mean, it's crucial that humanity not forget the significance of the flood. The flood is a physical depiction of how God feels about sin. When we see a high mountain, we mustn't forget why that mountain exists. The flood is a reminder of God's holiness and the necessity of human repentance if we want to please Him and if we want to be on the ark. It's a reminder that judgment can always be just around the corner when we least expect it. Isn't it amazing that God, uses the rainbow as this reminder? And guess who's taken the rainbow and pirated it and is using it as the symbol of the very things that likely caused the flood in the first place? So, isn't that terrible? How the Lord, what He did here has been forgotten to that point. But the flood is also a reminder of those who, like Noah, obey God can also be saved through water and receive the benefits of God's grace. Once the divine long-suffering waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared, 120 years, in which a few, that is 8 souls, were saved through water. There's also an antitype which now saves us, baptism, through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, not the removal of the filth of the flesh, the answer of a good conscience towards God. The bulk of the religious world around us, they reject that teaching too. If you don't like it, just reject it. See how well that goes for you in the end. Imagine how many people rejected Noah's teaching, which was just what God had him teach. They just rejected it. I don't like that teaching, I reject it. Okay, well, you're not on the ark, buddy. Sorry. I mean, that's what it always comes down to. Are you going to accept what God says or not? Eve said, no, not going to accept that. And every one of us since then has done the same thing. Every one of us. We've all done it. And the question is, are we willing to accept it and just humble ourselves and conform our life to it? Hardly anybody ever has said yes to that. And maybe many of us are in the same boat. What a sad thing. The bulk of the Lord's church is going to be lost for the same reason. The Bible's clear on that. The Bible describes those who are going to be saved as a remnant of a remnant. I mean, we're talking the crumbs. That's all that's going to make it. Are we going to be among them? Or are we going to be part of the next big judgment of God? All right. Hopefully you're thinking about maybe some questions that you might have as we have been covering this material. The session after lunch and the one tomorrow morning, we're going to start looking at responding to some of the pushback that we get on the stuff I presented. And you'll see why we needed to do this. Because the model as I've laid it out for you here can help you to respond to virtually any criticism people make against the flood. So we're going to start diving into some of those. So it's more the apologetic side of things, and that's faith building because you see how strong our case is. It's robust, our model. It is able to respond to criticism. Very much appreciate the attention you've given me. This is a lot of material. I know if your brains feel fried, don't complain about it because I'm feeling it myself up here. I feel fried too. All right, David, where are you at? Turn it over to you.